Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Hello again to everyone who joined us on July 23rd, and welcome to everyone joining us for the first time. First, some quick introductions. My name is Michael Brennan. I'm a program officer for the Technology and Society team at Ford Foundation. I'm a white man in my late 30s with a beard sitting in my home office. Josh?
Hi, I'm Josh Greenberg. I'm a program director at the Alfred B. Sloan Foundation, where I run the foundation's technology program. I'm a white man with black hair and a graying beard, sitting in a wood-paneled room.
Today, we're going to be sharing a bit of context about our digital infrastructure work. We'll then have a panel conversation and Q&A with our guest researchers. And finally, we will discuss the new request for proposals, along with another Q&A focused on that. For those of you who joined us last time, the first few minutes will be similar to what you heard, but stick around as the panel will start shortly. I want to again thank our amazing events, IT, communications, and support teams at Ford Foundation and Sloan Foundation. These events are a big production, like much bigger than you may realize as a viewer. So thank you to Sierra, Tara, Max, Jamara, Vivek, Bob, Matt, Joe, Liz, the Spitfire team, and everyone else involved in making them happen. I also want to mention our code of conduct. We have an open chat and we encourage discussion. But also we are dedicated to providing a harassment-free experience for everyone. We don't tolerate harassment of panelists or participants in any form, and we will promptly remove anyone who does so. If you feel harassed or concerned, please send a note to us via the chat. For example, you can send one to Sierra, Ford Events-Sierra, and someone from our events team will reach out to help. If you want to learn more about what constitutes harassment or improper behavior, there's a really great code of conduct from JSComp, which we'll be hearing more about later, and we're going to link to that in the chat. You can take a look. Before we get into the talks, we want to share a bit of history about how we got here. So digital infrastructure can be interpreted in a variety of ways. The protocols that govern the internet, the IT infrastructure of organizations, the critical platforms that we rely on. But one of the biggest forms of digital infrastructure is the vast ecosystem of open source code that we collectively rely upon. And indeed, that is relied upon by every other example I just gave. For many of you today, open source software is part of your daily reality. For others, it's an invisible layer that you may have only had the faintest idea of. For example, you've probably relied on OpenSSL dozens of times today, if not more, without realizing it. It's the open source project that keeps your web connection secure by making the lock on your address bar work. It's the sustainability, maintenance, and security of this form of digital infrastructure that we're here to talk about today. But why does an institution like Ford Foundation care? Ford Foundation's overriding focus is to fight inequality in all its forms. We have comprehensive strategies on criminal justice reform, worker rights, journalism, and so much more. But we also see the internet as a critical public good in the fight against inequality. As our president, Darren Walker, once noted, a society that depends on the internet cannot be just unless the internet is a just platform. When I joined Ford in 2015, we had a well-developed internet policy portfolio that focused on issues ranging from net neutrality to data privacy and surveillance. We realized that we were missing an important complement to this, the technical infrastructure of the internet. We can't build and protect an equitable internet that serves everyone through policy alone. The code, standards, and institutions of the internet need to be equally considered. Some of the areas of infrastructure we looked at were easier to develop strategies for. Supporting critical infrastructure projects like Let's Encrypt to creating a more secure web, or supporting groups like Article 19 to ensure that civil society is present at the technical standards bodies that govern the internet. What was harder was figuring out what, if any, role Ford should be playing, what, if any, role Ford should be playing in the open source ecosystem. In 2016, we supported Nadia Eghbal in her work to diagnose the public interest implications of open source infrastructure. Roads and Bridges, the unseen labor behind our digital infrastructure, helped build a popular understanding that there's a whole layer of code that is critical to an open and equitable internet. Yet the public interest community barely regarded it as the critical public commons that it has become. What to do about this, however, was less clear. We realized that before we can get to solutions, something funders are always looking for better or worse, we needed to ask more questions. I want to turn over to Josh to share a bit more about why Sloan cares about this work and tell us more about the research agenda we developed and turned into an RFP. Josh?
Thanks, Michael. So at the Sloan Foundation, we make grants primarily to support original research and education related to science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and economics. We believe that a reasoned, systematic understanding of the forces of nature and society, when applied inventively and wisely, can lead to a better world for all. Developments like modern computing and the internet have offered new challenges and opportunities to generalize, analyze, and share knowledge at unprecedented speed and scale. For just about a decade, I've led the Foundation's technology program, where we aim to support both the development of innovative technologies and the shaping of their broader social and institutional context. Over that time, Sloan's support for individual open source software tools and packages led us into a deeper interest in the layers of digital infrastructure on which science depends, as well as the individuals and institutions that maintain them. When it came out in 2016, the Roads and Bridges report marked out a problem space, and through a few conversations, Michael and I realized that while our foundations had different missions, we had come to similar interests in those underlying strata of digital infrastructure on which both social justice and scientific research rely. As we began to collaborate more substantively, we realized that others working in the space had a number of open questions regarding the actual practice of digital infrastructure. Things like who maintains it, what are their incentives for doing so, and what role should be played by institutions such as companies, software foundations, universities, and governments. We and other funders needed to better understand these issues so we could develop strategies grounded in evidence. So in 2017, we brought together a group of researchers with leading open source practitioners to map out a research agenda. That turned into the questions that were laid out in the 2018 request for proposals on the economics and maintenance of digital infrastructure. When you launch an RFP, you don't know what you're going to get, but the responses surpassed our highest hopes. We received hundreds of applications, of which the vast majority were directly and squarely aligned with the goals of the RFP. We drew on the expertise of outside reviewers from the research and practitioner communities to ensure that both that the research designs were robust and that the findings would be useful with the communities and practices being studied. In the end, the applicant pool was so strong that we ended up substantively increasing each of our foundation's funding for the projects to a total pool of $1.3 million. It's an amazing portfolio of projects, and we're thrilled for you to learn more about their work today and in the coming weeks. I'll turn back to Michael to introduce our panel for today.
Thanks, Josh. And we'll have Josh join us again soon to do the Q&A session of this panel. And I'd like to invite all the panelists to turn on their videos. And we're going to get to everyone here in a minute. But before we do that, I'm going to give a little introduction about our panel. So today, we're going to talk a lot about two issues that we believe are core to the idea of open source as a form of digital infrastructure: equity and sustainability. And we'll hear from a few of the researchers that were funded by Ford Foundation and Sloan Foundation over the past year and a half. We know that sexism, racism, harassment, and other forms of systemic inequality manifest in open source like they do in all systems that we rely on every day. But the specifics of how these forms of inequality and bias manifest in open source are less well understood and worthy of greater attention. Why? Well, in part because the ways that open source is built and maintained are unique, and because we don't believe that digital infrastructure can be a sustainable public good that serves everyone unless it represents the needs of everyone. And that requires diverse, open, welcoming communities that build and maintain open source technologies, as well as a better understanding of the legal, policy, and regulatory mechanisms in which community norms evolve and in which govern public goods in general, not just digital public goods. So we're going to turn to our panelists, and I'm going to let them all introduce themselves via the first question I want to ask everyone. So Laura Davish, we're going to start with you. And can you introduce yourself and your affiliation, and tell us what questions did you address in your research, and what was the biggest insight you got from that research?
Thank you, Michael. So my name is Laura Dabish. I'm a white woman with shoulder-length brown hair wearing a black shirt, sitting in my living room next to a blue sofa with lots of pillows. I'm an associate professor in the Human-Computer Interaction Institute and the Heinz College of Public Policy and Information Systems and Management at Carnegie Mellon University. In my research group, we study social, technical, and policy issues around new forms of technology-supported work, communication, and creative collaboration. So we're using behavioral science research methods to understand the dynamics of software development communities and other online communities to inform design and policy. As part of our digital infrastructure project, our research addressed the issue of gender representation in open source software, where less than 5% of contributors are women, according to different surveys, and depending on the project, it could be even lower. So we were interested in understanding why. We wanted to look at in our project how people become core contributors in digital infrastructure projects specifically, and how those pathways and experiences differed for men versus women. We did deep interviewing with a set of men and women who were core contributors within a specific ecosystem, and we discussed their participation history and experiences, and we're also looking at digital trace data on GitHub. And one of the biggest insights that we got from our work was that direct ties to other members on a specific project were particularly critical for women contributors in our sample. So invitation was instrumental in their initial joining of a project versus the men in our sample who more often were hired into a project or used it in their work. And direct connections to other project members provided a safe space for asking questions without looking stupid and for receiving mentorship. So in our work, we also learned about some other things like the value of community, the role of corporate influence, and some of the unique challenges that women contributors faced that I hope we can get into during this discussion.
Laura, thank you so much. And I'm really excited to get into some of those other points as well. And we're going to have more time to get to them. I'm going to turn to Caroline Sinders now. Caroline, I have the same question for you. If you could introduce yourself and tell us about the questions that you addressed in your research and the biggest insight you got from that research.
Sure, thank you. Hi, I'm Caroline Sinders. I'm an independent machine learning design researcher and artist. I'm dialing in from Central Europe. I'm a white woman with brown hair, red lipstick, and I'm wearing a white shirt. And I study the intersections of technology's impact in society through interface design, artificial intelligence, harassment, and politics, generally in digital, conversational, or online spaces. I'm also the founder of my own lab, Convocation Design and Research, which is committed to designing for public good. My recent research has explored what global volunteer communities, like the many official JavaScript conferences and meetups, can tell us about community health initiatives and harassment mitigation. JavaScript is the world's most popular programming language. And like a lot of technical communities, there are issues of toxicity and a lack of diversity. But JavaScript conferences, JSConfs, generally called JSConfs, are an exception to this. They are diverse communities. These national conferences and local chapters are in cities around the world, and they show how open source spaces can create strong codes of conduct that combat harassment and scale up to meet the growing demands for equity, inclusivity, and safety as these communities themselves continue to expand. Through my research, my own personal experiences, and conversations with active participants in these communities, I quickly learned that most of these groups trace their own codes of conduct back to a singular source, the Geek Feminism Wiki's Code of Conduct for Conference Anti-Harassment Policies. This code of conduct clearly articulates expectations for members of the community with regard to how they will behave towards each other, and just as importantly, outlines how the code of conduct will be enforced and violations reported. But what I also found that is, even though these open source communities are using a code of conduct all based on a singular source, that there is currently no generally shared code of conduct for these spaces, mostly due to decentralized leadership, even if they are iterating off of each other's code of conduct. And that planning and development for many JavaScript conferences and meetup around the world is also very decentralized. So as a result, the wheel is constantly being reinvented rather than improved and refined. Internal best practices and findings on combating harassment are not shared publicly, and many groups are working, learning, and adapting in isolation from one another. There are currently no real repositories for groups to pull from as they continue to build safe and equitable spaces for engaged open source communities. It's not enough to just have a code of conduct, but we need concise and consistent responses to harassment. So having a clear, robust code of conduct is necessary in creating a legible framework for all attendees to feel safe, but a code of conduct needs to be implemented and implementation needs to be taught.
Caroline, thank you so much. That was really, really great. Anusha, I want to turn to you and ask you the same question. You know, you took you were looking at the global focus of open source, and what questions within that did you address, and what were some of the biggest insights you got from your research?
Sure, thanks, Michael. So hi, everyone. My name's Anusha Hussain. I'm a tan woman with black hair wearing a white collar shirt, and I'm a PhD student at the University of California, Berkeley, studying how technology travels across borders. Like Michael was saying, my project looks at regional open source software communities and questions what we know about their participants. As the bulk of our knowledge is based on the West, I instead look at communities in Dhaka, Bangladesh, a major city in South Asia, to explore whether our mental models of open source hold from this different vantage point. So when we look at scans of code repositories, we often get the impression that there's little activity happening in places like South Asia. Yet we're also seeing regional communities continuing to form around major projects. So what I ask is, what drives their formation? What kind of work might be occurring outside of the code repository? And how might we leverage and better support them to strengthen the open source ecosystem at large? So I used ethnographic methods to answer these questions, observing and interviewing participants virtually and in person in Dhaka. What I found is that participation often takes the form of work that we typically classify as kind of peripheral activities: translation and localization, user support, bug testing, evangelism. This could be a result of environmental conditions in Dhaka, like an outdated computer science curriculum, flows of traffic, electricity outages, familial responsibilities. These are things that make sustained coding difficult. But I actually think this has more to do with the way major technology projects, both open and closed source, have looked to places like Bangladesh and the Global South to do these tasks as a way to channel participants' interest in their projects and market their software in that locale. And in return, they provide swag, travel opportunities, and reputation. I think we, as funders and researchers, need to revisit how we make sense of participants in regional communities like those in Dhaka, Bangladesh. The traditional framework has been to think of everyone as a potential code contributor. Maybe with more guidance and mentorship, a bug tester can become a code maintainer. But we also need to recognize that today, community members also resemble brand ambassadors, building product loyalty, or even gig workers, completing piecemeal tasks without feeling empowered to contribute to the direction of the product. So kind of depending on which framework we subscribe to, there's a different recommendation for how to support the communities. My work suggests that at the least, it's time to think critically about how we approach regional communities as open source matures and expands globally.
Anusha, thank you so much. I think all these projects are so interesting because they unpack these different forms of barriers, right, to building this broad, more diverse community that is engaging in open source projects. I want to turn to you, Thomas, because I think there's another way to look at this as well, which is looking at this question of, well, how do we even govern and support, diverse public goods in general? And I know you all did some work thinking about, other forms of public goods around the world and what are the different mechanisms for maintaining and supporting them. So I have the same question for you, which is, can you tell us a bit more about the research questions you addressed and what the biggest insights you got from them?
Sure, thanks, Michael, and hello, everyone. My name is Thomas Strines. I'm a bearded white man in my mid-30s, wearing a pink polo shirt today and sitting in a farmhouse in Massachusetts. I worked on this project with my colleagues, Benedict Kingsbury, Angelina Fischer, and Sebastian Benthal, and a team of excellent students to explore how legal institutions and devices could be adapted to support digital infrastructure going forward. And in this research, we combine lessons from infrastructure studies with legal analysis, and we call this thinking infrastructurally. And the main move there is to understand infrastructure not just as a metaphor or as a thing, but as a set of relations, processes, and imaginations. And so we believe that to understand infrastructures, one needs to understand the technical dimensions, the social dimensions, and the organizational dimensions, and the entanglement to figure out how law then might contribute to advancing interests such as publicness or fairness. And this is really how our project connects with Anusha's, Laura's, and Caroline's, because all these different initiatives operate in certain legal frameworks. And that also means that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to this one legal change that would make a positive difference. But we see potential for interventions in certain contexts, at least. So to give just one example, if governments or other public actors, municipalities, increasingly procure open source software for governmental needs to provide public services, we see this as an opportunity to inject their desire to have more support for the maintenance of digital infrastructure overall, and that could be built in as a conditionality. So that's one idea we explored, and I'm happy to talk more about others.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, everyone. I'm super excited for when all the papers going to be out and everyone can engage with them all. We're going to go to a couple more questions from me, but I also want to remind everyone that we're going to be doing an open Q&A with everyone in attendance here today, and that will happen in, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes or so, but we'd encourage you to start adding your questions into the Q&A tool on Zoom right now so that we can start, parsing through them and prioritizing them and things like that. So the sooner you get your questions in, the better. And feel free to direct them to everyone or to individual folks here on the call. So you all have given some great overviews of your work, and you all are covering a lot of ground. And I want to actually come back a bit though to this question of why? Why are these questions so important? And Laura, I'm going to suggest I'm going to bring this question to you first, but feel free to kick it on to other folks if you would like to, which is, what is the reason that this question of equity is so important in the context of open source? Why do we care if our digital infrastructure is open and inclusive to all people? Why do we care that, by some measures, less than 5% of contributors are women, in this case? Why does that matter?
So it's a great question. So we see kind of at least 3 reasons that it matters. So one is just the fundamental sustainability of open source. So the quality of the software itself, the performance of these projects should go up as the kind of diversity of the contributors, the contributors are more diverse. So in other settings, there's lots of research showing these positive effects of diversity, that gender and racial diversity are associated with greater creativity and performance in teams. And my own collaborator in this research, Bogdan Vasilescu, has work showing that it actually results in higher productivity in open source projects. So having more women on your project results in higher productivity. So enhancing diversity should enhance the performance of digital infrastructure projects, improve their efficiency, their reliability, the code they produce. We also know that it matters who codes, right? So biases get embedded in the design of the systems that we create. So we see this from all the work now on algorithmic bias, that who codes is really important to the inclusiveness of the technology itself. Joy Buolamwini's work showing this inability of facial recognition technology to recognize Black faces or people of color. So there's this impact of representation in that way. And then there's also this issue of just the workforce to maintain these projects. So just enhancing the pool of available effort if we don't include women and include underrepresented other underrepresented groups in this kind of work. I'll pass it on to my other. Go ahead, Michael.
Michael, you're muted.
Thank you. I was going to ask you, Caroline, to jump in here if you had anything you want to add to Laura's point.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the way I think about it also too is from a product standpoint. So I'm a design researcher. I look at how the design of systems, how that affects people. And so if we're looking even just beyond open source projects, but really at the creation of technology, when the question is asked, why be inclusive, let's stretch that word as far as it can go. Why also build accessible products? It's actually better for a bottom line to build more accessible, inclusive products, right? When you're designing for all audiences, it can be used by then all audiences. It's so expensive to go back and retrofit something or rebuild something or insert a process into anything. And that's true, I think, even in conferences, right? If you've created a conference, now pulling from my research, and it's not very safe, people are not really going to attend. And that affects then very logically your bottom line. And it takes more time and more effort to go back and actually redesign things. So if you are designing with a diverse group of people and designing for a diverse group of people, you're actually building already from the outset a much broader base. And you're designing just better, more high quality products, things, and experiences. So that's always the sort of advice I give back. It's way more expensive to have to remake things after you've made them.
That's very, very, very true. Anusha, I feel like we're on a path here that might make the global context obvious, but I still want to hear what you think here. And I particularly like that framing you had about this idea of thinking, how do we make sure that we're thinking of everyone as a code contributor? Can you talk a bit about this question of why this is important in this context of building a more globally diverse community?
Sure. I think one of the biggest insights for me, talking to people and reviewing the literature, was that open source has changed a lot from its early beginnings in the 90s to today. It's not the same kind of hobbyist pursuit between the relatively equal participants that it once was. There's a lot of capital flowing into projects now. Participation is more systematized in big projects, and our consciousness at large in society around labor has evolved. So I think kind of talking to people in Dhaka, but also in other major Asian cities, I think people can see this, and questions of fairness are beginning to come up. So a specific example that I encountered from a community I studied in Dhaka was around this issue of fair labor, where an older participant felt like the project's core staff were exploiting the labor of Bangladeshi participants. He thought that they should be paid, or that the work that they were doing wasn't worth their time. But it used to be, before it didn't have this kind of unequal playing field from his perspective. But the newer members I talked to from that same project were happy to do bug testing and marketing sprints, which is mostly what they were being asked to do, because it allowed them to gain status, and they felt like it was valuable to be part of this international project. So there are kind of different levels of consciousness around this, but I think it's something for all of us to think about as open source leaders.
Yeah, thank you. And Thomas, I want to ask you a version of this question too. Like, why is it important that we look to the governance of other forms of goods when we examine, sustainability in this space? I'm curious on your take on this, because I remember still when I read, your original proposal, I was kind of like, these are great questions, and I'm surprised that no one else has really asked them in an intentional way before. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure, happy to. I think it really ties into what my other co-panelists have articulated, which is by foregrounding this question about equity and values, one asks harder questions about the open source governance ecosystem as a whole. And with our approach to infrastructure and law, what we try to bring to the table is precisely this analysis, where one can have a kind of constructive approach to law, where law is kind of part of a solution that achieves some good in the world, but there are also critical perspectives on law, and particularly prominent in the US, that point out how law can entrench inequalities or might fall short. And we are trying to push this kind of angle into the open source space, where there are established institutions and governance arrangements that go back decades. And as Anusha pointed out, there have been shifts in the ecosystem, and that then raises the question whether there might be a need for recalibration and adaptation. And in that context, one can really learn from looking at other examples. Just to name one, traditional discourse about internet governance institutions such as ICANN, which has tried to pioneer a hybrid model with multi-stakeholderism, but runs into really hard questions about what it really means to be transparent. Because it's not good enough to just have something on the internet. You also need to make sure that it's accessible and that people actually go there. And same for participation. The theoretical possibility to participate cannot be, it's not the same thing as people actually participating and being represented in a diverse and multinational configuration, as Anusha pointed out.
Thanks, Thomas. We're going to get to Q&A really soon, but I have one last question I want to ask all of you. Let's try and do, you all are actually so concise and targeted. You all are great panelists. Let's try, and we'll try and do kind of a bit more of a rapid fire, so we can get through this in just a few minutes. Well, my question, we'll just go through the list for each of you, is I'm curious, what insider outcome of your work do you want to see studied further, or like what new question opened up in your work that you're excited to share? So if you want to pick something just to mention before we get to the Q&A with Josh, that would be great. And well, Laura, we'll start with you.
Okay, so I think one big insight from our work that it would be great to see more work on, and we're also hoping to look at more, is the value of community work. So the actual effort that goes into sort of building and sustaining the community around the project, that social infrastructure actually requires maintenance as well. And Anusha kind of talked about how that some of those aspects were critical in the work that the contributors that she looked at were also doing. So it really should be recognized as its own, as a valuable aspect of contribution effort. And we're interested in, I think it's an important question to look at how that work is distributed across different kinds of contributors, and what a successful community spaces look like in terms of sort of creating and maintaining them, but also in terms of creating like a diverse and inclusive environment that's sustainable. So that's, I think, one of the main things that we hope that is followed up on. Thanks.
Caroline?
Sure, yeah. So one thing I found really interesting was actually trying to dig into what are implementation trainings that currently exist out in the wild. And there are a few. They're just really difficult to find indexed on Google for a variety of strange reasons. And I think a lot of that comes back to something really basic that maybe we forget in civil society or the academy, which is SEO really matters. So there's actually there are training guides. They exist there. You really have to dig for them. And what I've found in my own digging with a couple of different clean browsers is you also have to know the name of the author. So one thing I've been really interested in is actually kind of mapping this knowledge loss and the fact that there's these really disjointed tools and toolkits people can use to learn how to implement codes of conduct and respond to harassment, but they're just difficult to find. So one thing I think is potential solutions forward. There has to be some kind of easier to find repository or public link where people can go through and read these different kinds of training guides that already exist out in the world. Or, hopefully this report will help with that, it being linked off Ford's website. But it would also be great to see funding that's made more available to community organizers themselves to either disperse these trainings or have someone pay someone to actually hold these trainings regularly. So it's regular occurring, reinforced forms of social infrastructure, right? So better planning and building better community health, which currently there isn't really a lot of things like that. There aren't classes people can take with a real person.
Thanks for that. Anusha?
So I think two things. One is to redo the type of study I did, maybe a close ethnographic study of a specific region. I only looked at Bangladesh, and maybe that's representative of South Asia to some extent, but we should do the same thing in East Asia and Latin America and Africa, Europe. And I think there are some studies, but not too many, that have been done in the past 5 or 6 years. And then secondly, to kind of echo what Laura was mentioning, I think we should have some impact evaluations of the types of activities that regional communities do. What difference does it make to have something translated or localized? I suspect there is a difference, right? And it'd be nice to point to a statistic. So that type of work would be great.
And Thomas.
Sure, I think the biggest shift that we've seen in our research is what Anusha mentioned earlier, that the whole software industry seems to endorse open source software development models as the mode of doing business today. And while that is to be welcomed in lots of ways, it also complicates what it means to be open source and what this ecosystem looks like, and whether one can still speak of a coherent ecosystem as a whole, where there are certain tendencies of concentration of data or concentration of other kinds of infrastructures, such as cloud infrastructure, on which open source software development increasingly relies. And we think it also shifts the question around sustainability and maintenance. So in future work, what we would like to look at is whether there might be a need for novel organizations that are dedicated towards maybe smaller scale projects, assuming that the big infrastructures will be maintained by the big tech companies or by a foundation such as the Linux Foundation. But there might be smaller digital infrastructures that we overlook and that need more funding, and then associate with that a governance structure that makes sure that the funding achieves what is set to achieve.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to just quickly turn over to Josh here, who's going to funnel some questions in from the audience, and I will take a break on video, and looking forward to hearing your answers. So Josh.
Thanks. We've got some great questions already, and I would encourage people to continue putting questions in the Q&A. Let me start with a couple questions specifically targeted to individual people. I'll start with a question from Danielle Robinson for Caroline. Caroline, how would you approach studying or understanding code of conduct implementation and particularly enforcement? What do you think are the most impactful questions to ask or things to learn about?
Thank you so much for that question, Danielle. One of the things I got to do before COVID happened was I was able to attend some of the events. And so as an attendee, I went up and asked volunteers about codes of conduct and what I should do if I was harassed, and like what would happen if I filed a report to different volunteers. I also interviewed the organizers and asked them to walk me through a couple of different scenarios of how they would respond to different forms of harassment. I then asked them how they train up their staff and different organizers they've worked with. In some cases, I was actually able to, at the conferences, interview the volunteers separately from the core organizers. So like the core team that plans every year the conference, whereas there's revolving volunteers. And so that was also helpful in figuring out what little training or how much training volunteers were undergoing specifically around things like online harassment. So sadly, I found in person to be one of the best ways to do that. But generally, if you're conducting any of this research, I would say remotely, it's always good to give people a variety of scenarios and hear how they would respond. In some cases, there are things called the ladder of consequences, which some organizers will map out like which consequences sit where in terms of a ladder of escalation. So certain actions may be like seen as less extreme and certain actions may be more extreme, and they will need different kinds of reactions to those actions. So certain things like that has been helpful.
Thanks, Caroline. Another question, actually, this one for Anusha. Anusha, did you see a difference in types of participation between smaller open source projects with a regional public interest focus relative to large corporate open source? Do you see that as a useful variable to consider in studying the kind of work you do?
So I didn't actually find any regional open source software projects in the sense that they're totally homegrown and focused inward towards Bangladesh, if that's what the question is asking. But I did see differences in kind of the scale of the project. So if there's a bigger project that has kind of established protocols for bringing in volunteers and having them, funneling them towards certain types of work that tended to have a longer life, like some of those projects had been in Bangladesh for 10 or 15 years, whereas newer ones that maybe had stronger communities in the West but hadn't quite figured out how to bring in their international participants, those ones would stick around for maybe a year tops. And then it seemed like they would just kind of fall by the wayside. So I think having clear rules for how you can participate is one way that a project can bring in different participants, and thinking about what the skill sets are for global participants or non-Western participants, I think is helpful.
That's great, thank you. Turning to maybe Thomas, I'll ask you a question from, or direct first to you, a question from Dragan Espenshede. I'd be interested to know if there are any insights into the limits of openness in open source or open licenses for data and potential excluding effects that these might have.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm happy to answer that because it connects to other research we do on global data law and studying out how data as a regulatory object is being treated. And I think one can clearly see the parallels and the differences there in how the licensing schemes for data and software have developed differently. And I think what comes out of that research is quite clearly that just because something is open doesn't mean that everyone benefits equally from it. And if there's openness with regard to one items, be it software or data, there might be other ways of establishing exclusion or capturing value. And we think that might be particularly pronounced in a context in which a lot of the algorithms for machine learning, artificial intelligence development are open source, but the data necessary to actually train those models might not be, and vice versa. And the question then is what to do about it. And we looked quite intensively into different initiatives in the open source ecosystem to maybe change that by adopting new conditions that run into the face of long-standing values of openness. And I personally not radically against or in favor of it, but it doesn't seem to be a solution that really gets at the heart of the issue, because it will always be a small-scale intervention, which again doesn't mean that in some contexts it might be actually valuable to question openness and to establish a more differentiated, more managed access regime. But in other contexts, what we would be more interested in is preserving the openness value by building around a governance infrastructure that ensures that these other mechanisms of exclusion are curtailed through transparency or other forms of governance mechanisms.
Thanks. Okay, let me turn to a question from Justin Flory. Laura, maybe I'll direct this to you first and then ask anybody else who has thoughts to jump in. Justin asks, do conversations around equity and inclusivity change depending on whether the open source community is decentralized or not? For example, the Fedora project is a digital infrastructure managed by Red Hat and closely tied to its business interests, but Fedora is also a large, diverse, and global community with smaller sub-communities around the world. So how do you think about decentralization in the context of these questions?
I think that's a really interesting question, and that would be a really cool thing to look at in future research. One place where it sort of came up in our work was in terms of how it shapes the decision-making structure in a specific community. So how open and transparent, are the discussions around changes around how the project itself is managed? So how involved do people then feel, as part of a community, or how much agency do they think they have in terms of like weighing in on those decisions? So that I think could be like one potential influence. But yeah, I think that's a really good question in terms of also how well you're able to have like a uniform culture or endorse kind of equity or inclusion efforts on a project.
I'll just open up. I'm curious if anybody else has thoughts on that. I mean, not to put you on the spot, but Caroline, I'd be curious in terms of code of conduct adoption or formation. Does decentralization relative to more centralization seem to play a role in effectiveness?
I guess it depends. I think it's contextual on the individual community itself. So for example, with the JS comps, while they are technically decentralized, to use the branding of a JS comp, to even use the name, there's a series of agreements you have to agree to. So you have to have attended a JS conf before. You have to have a code of conduct. You have to have a mentor from another JS conference, like another JS conf that's existed. So generally, like, it's this interesting mix of you can approach them or they may approach you if you are chatting at one of the conferences, like, oh, I'm an attendee. I love these. I wish I had one in, I don't know, in India, which there was supposed to be a JSConf India this year, but due to COVID, it's been paused. And someone will tell you, like, that's great. Here's all the things you do. And they do at some point walk you through the process. But so there's like a main sort of center point, which has been like the JSConf EU conference, which is one of the longest running ones. But generally, like, the process is also fairly hands-off. Like, no one is necessarily, like, there's not a lot of like mini checkpoints you have to go through. So I think it depends. And this kind of like semi-decentralized model of here are the things you have to do, but we're also like the the one who set up the structure, we're not necessarily checking on you doing that, is something that also exists in meetups like Queer.js, which is a part of the JSConf family, where there's many different cities that have a Queer.js spinoff, or with Global Diversity CFP Day, which is also in the JavaScript family as well, because the founder of that was the founder of Scotland.js, also in the family. So you have all these strange things where it's like you can go online, download this thing, here are the tool, like the steps you have to do, but we're also not, as like the originator or the original creator of the original JSConf, we're not checking in on you that you do that beyond these very specific things you have to do. So
Got it.
It really depends. Sorry.
It depends is often the lesson of good deep embedded research. One last question. Oh, please go ahead.
Can I just add on to that? I think one thing too that's sort of interesting about it, and that Carolyn's kind of response brings up, is that the centralization can potentially take some of the burden off of projects for like social infrastructure, quote unquote, social infrastructure management, or providing like resources for inclusion and diversity. So having like mentorship programs that are at that level. So that I think is another kind of important thing to think about.
That makes a lot of sense. One very last question we have, I want to make sure to ask this, but I'll ask you to think quickly. We'll call it a sort of lightning round sort of wrap up. So Irina Itzma asked, could the panelists speak to what actors might be best placed to advocate for and support efforts to increase diversity? Should or could this role be taken on by the open source community, software or tech firms, funding agencies, or as Ann Stapleton also asked separately, potentially governing bodies or the government or government agencies themselves. Maybe, I don't know if anybody wants to raise their hand and dive in, or could Caroline, please? And I think if we can all be quickly answer, then we'll have to move on.
Sure. So one thing that is prevalent and reoccurring inside of these JSConfs is actually there's diversity already at the top of the core organizers. And then that is a guiding structure in terms of making sure there's diversity everywhere. What is interesting, and this is something that I brought up in a presentation a few weeks ago at Ford, was thinking through even diversity of topics. So like community health, for example. So there will be a diversity of participants and speakers inside of a technical conference, and then a diversity of talks from less technical to more technical. But I think what would even improve diversity efforts is more open conversations around community health and bringing that into the technical space and viewing it as a technical talk, for example.
Anybody else like to jump in? Who can be effective advocates, actors in different contexts?
Do you want to go?
I was going to just say, our kind of hope is that project owners themselves can be sponsors in this case, like sort of advocating for more diversity. And I think Carolyn makes a good point. It's something we've seen in our research as well, that the presence of women already on a project actually attracts more women. So having diversity can increase diversity just by sending a signal that it's valued and that this is a place where that you can join.
Anusha, were you going to jump in?
I was going to say about the same thing. I think project leaders are best positioned to make changes, especially like those in prominent projects. But I think there is a place for researchers to be doing this kind of work and talking about diversity and adding some numbers, adding some anecdotes. I think it's all about like a shift in consciousness we can all contribute to.
Thanks. I think we are at time for this portion of the call. I think I would like to thank the speakers and panelists once again and bring Michael back. We'll spend the last 10 minutes or so talking about the next RFP going forward. So thanks again, everybody. Oh, and if you had questions, we will follow up. We'll all have a chance to weigh in on answers to questions that weren't answered here, and we'll be circulating those responses in the near future. So yes, so as you can see, there's some really great stuff that has been coming out of the funded projects from the first cohort. And for Michael and I, our biggest takeaway is really, wow, there's a lot more work to be done. So we've been delighted to announce that a new RFP has been issued. A lot is similar to the last RFP, but there are a couple of notable additions. The first is that we're still asking researchers to look at the definition, assessment, and maintenance of critical open source infrastructure. That's a through line. As you heard today, there are no easy answers to these questions, but we think there's a lot of great work that can be built on top of the work done by this cohort of researchers, as well as new questions that have come into focus over the past 2 years.
Thanks, Josh. We're also driving a renewed focus on issues of identifying and dismantling the ways in which systemic inequality manifests in open source, better understanding the ideal roles and forms of accountability for the private sector, and developing policy and regulatory considerations that can ensure the long-term sustainability of this infrastructure. Also, we're not just funding research anymore. Our vision has always been for this research to drive change, and so we are funding the implementation of research findings. We welcome interventions, pilot programs, and any other form of implementation that takes research outcomes and puts them into practice. And finally, we're super excited to be joined by Open Society Foundations and Mozilla in this effort. So it's not just Ford and Sloan anymore. There are 4 funders behind this. And if you happen to be a funder of this call and you're considering joining an effort like this, please do reach out. With our remaining time, we're gonna answer any questions folks have about the RFP in particular. So please submit those questions in, and we will also be cataloging these questions because I know we're not gonna get to all of them in our remaining 10 minutes. Josh, were there any that came to mind for you already? That
I mean, I can jump up. Actually, a couple of the very first questions that were asked. Devika asks, does the research RFP prefer technological research to policy research? I think we try to look holistically at these issues. My own training, I tend to like thinking about socio-technical systems, and I think we both understand that technology exists in a social and a policy and a governance context. And as you can see from the work that was talked about today, I think understanding those dimensions are really important. At the same time, I think we are anchored in particular kinds of technologies, in particular technical practice. So I wouldn't say there's a preference. I'd say I have a bias particularly towards things that think holistically. But Michael, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I agree. I also think that the most important thing, if you're considering applying for the RSP, the most important thing is to think about what are your unique strengths that you can bring and that your team can bring. I think we are thinking holistically about the portfolio of grants that will come from this. Whether each individual project thinks broadly or narrowly is kind of like less relevant than what the whole picture is. Like one thing I appreciate about Anusha's research, for example, is she scoped it very narrowly. Like we're looking at Bangladesh and this community here, and that does not tell us everything we need to know about international developer or non-Western developer communities, but it gives us a case study on which we can then build upon more research. Like that, it's equally as valid of an approach as someone that wants to do a broader kind of comparative study of different intervention points in the space. I think same goes for the kind of spectrum of policy to technical points of research, or whether you want to like blow up that spectrum entirely.
Yep. Michael, I can keep asking questions from the.
Please
so maybe if you want to take a first stab, what's the max duration we can fund a project for?
Yeah, great question. So I would say we don't come to this with any like preset hard ideas. I will say most projects funded last time fell in the like 12, well, I think largely due to the pandemic, 12 to 18 month range. There were projects that were proposed for 6 months. There were projects that were proposed for 2 years or longer. And keep in mind that this RFP, we are not soliciting full proposals right here. We are soliciting concept notes.
Concepts.
Our goal is for people to get as many ideas in as possible that we can review. We don't want to have a high bar of entry. This is a very competitive process. We only funded a small fraction of concept notes that came in last time. And if your concept note is strong, we will invite a full proposal. Last time we were fortunate to be able to fund every full proposal we invited in, though I think every single one did some sort of scoping adjustments to reduce the overall scope. But that's part of the idea here, is that like, tell us what you think should really be done, put it in a concept note, and if that idea is strong, if the core idea is strong, and you move forward, we'll engage in conversation about the right time, size, all those kinds of.
Yeah, I think that I would just add, I think there's a key point, because there are 1 or 2 questions that are about, is a particular project in scope? I think we intend that the bar to entry, the effort required to put in a concept note is low enough and we just don't have the capacity to answer everybody individually about what's in scope. I mean, that first pass is intended to decide what's in scope. We would encourage you, if you think that your research resonates with the kinds of things you've heard today, or the kinds of things you're seeing in the project descriptions elsewhere, or that you'll hear about in 2 weeks, please just go ahead and put in a concept note, and don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good in framing that. Michael, Kimberly Davies says, several of our teams are excited about the RFP. Are you open to multiple submissions from the same organization?
Yeah, absolutely. We've gotten a few questions along these lines. Multiple submissions from the same organization are fine. If you're already a grantee of one of the funders, that's fine. Like, there's no, we've gotten a lot of questions that people asking, I'm based here or I'm based there, can I apply? Everything is fine at the moment. Of course, if you move forward to the proposal phase, we have to do a compliance analysis that we do on every grant. But at this moment, we don't have restrictions on who can apply or how they can apply. The bar is meant to be a low bar to entry, so you can get your ideas.
I want to jump in and just ask one. I think we have time for one last question. Does the research RFP prefer that the proposal address as many issues as possible, or focus on only one research question? For example, any of the 7 illustrative questions on the website. I'll say, I think trying to boil the ocean is, trying to capture everything in a research question means it's going to be diffuse enough that you're not going to be telegraphing that you'll really make progress on a particular question. How to improve digital infrastructure is going to be too broad and open. But the illustrative questions are intended specifically to be illustrative and at the kind of level of scope that we thought makes sense, that we've seen be successful in the previous call. But I don't think we have a precise sense we're going in with about what the right scope of a question is.
Yeah, I agree. And since the last question, I might use this to kind of just share some advice to anyone on the call that is looking to apply. When I think about the strong applications that came in last time, one is that they were well scoped. It was a clear, concise, pointed research project that took a piece of this overall agenda, didn't try and do a lot of it. Two, going back to Thomas's earlier point, the proposals were thinking infrastructurally, right? Like that is the most important context to apply to this. I think, we got plenty of proposals that were like, I do this specific open source project and I want to make it better. That's important, but what's more important is for this RFP is to think infrastructurally. How is the result of your project going to improve the broader ecosystem of open source, specifically in how it acts as infrastructure for society and infrastructure for internet? Like, that is the overriding question that you should be asking yourself when you're trying to figure out, is my idea in scope here, or not? There's a word limit on the concept note for good reason. Like, I think every question has a maximum of 200 words. We want you to distill your idea to its essence. We don't want you to unpack it in great detail. We want you to make that concise pitch so it doesn't take you much time, and also so we can read as many as possible. So keep these things in mind.
Yep.
I should mention the next event. Should I do that, Josh?
Yeah. Go for it.
So we have one more of these events. So all of these events, we were doing 3 total. This is originally going to be a day-and-a-half long convening in New York. And I actually think that this format has worked out better because it's allowed for a much broader engagement with a much larger audience. We had, at one point, we had over 180 people on the call today, I believe. So it's exciting to see how much interest there is in it. We are doing one more of these on August 20th. If you registered for this event, you will get an email inviting you to that next event, RSVP for it. Depending on the interest, we may decide to do another Q&A session or something like that, but I would really encourage you to join that session, send your questions in. There's also a great Q&A function on the RFP link itself, and we've been answering those and getting the answers public and available for everyone to see. So we hope to see you at this next event. We're going to hear from 4 more researchers from our previous launch, and then again have this Q&A session. Josh, anything else you want to add here?
I think I just want to say thanks again to the panelists today who have been doing incredible work, and I appreciate them taking the time to share a little bit. And thanks again to the production team who, as always, have made this work incredibly smoothly.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
See you
in 2 weeks.
See you in 2 weeks.